Folks, our first on-demand workshop, How to Become a Coffee Consultant, is now available for you to learn at your own pace for just €50, and it comes with a certificate upon completion. Go to mapperforward.coffee/workshops or click the link in the show notes for more details. Support this podcast by supporting our sponsors. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 2 of our 5-part series with my twin sister, Lena Parker, and we are talking energy security and the coffee supply chain. Hi, Lena.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. That was supernatural, by the way. Anyway,
Nice.
In the last episode, we kind of framed the conversation over the 5-part series, right? And today we want to start dissecting some terms. So let's start with the term energy security. What does energy security mean?
Very simply put, energy security means ensuring that you have a consistent supply of energy when you need it. Full stop, exclamation mark.
Okay, fantastic. The next term I want to understand is a term that you mentioned at the Harry Styles gig last night, which was electrification.
Electrification. Yeah. So if I take the example from the last podcast or the last episode, which was around your coffee roasters using gas as a part of their process into, is it fair to say the roaster?
Yep.
Yeah. So gas is an energy source.
Mm-hmm.
The price of gas is going through the roof, and gas itself is a high emitter of emissions, a high polluter of emissions. And so the whole world needs to stop using pollutants. And so we will move to electricity. And that is the process of electrification. And why we're moving to electricity is because we know that we're moving away from high-polluting fossil fuels to generate our electricity. So we will be moving to a renewable electricity, which will mean using electricity as part of the process rather than gas is cleaner, what we call cleaner. And so it doesn't eventually it will produce far less emissions than it does today.
Okay. So then other thing I want to understand is zero emissions. Because people say like EVs have no emissions, right? But that's if you start from the point of the EV and on. But the point up to creating an electric vehicle, it has an extraordinary amount of emissions, right? Like, and the social impact that it has in that process is a whole different thing than, I guess, what we're talking about when we say emissions. But help us understand, like, what zero emissions means. Is it the same thing as net zero?
So we tend to talk about two things: net zero or absolute zero. So the most of the world has agreed and signed up to getting to net zero by 2050. So net zero, that means that they are effectively that they are, when they add up all of their emissions, so in some cases they will be still polluting. So let's say, I'm going to make these numbers up. Let's say they're polluting 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide, which is the way that we measure emissions, but they will be offsetting that with an extra 100,000 tons of that they're not. So net zero means they're offsetting. Absolute zero means that they are not emitting anything at all.
So that's what we call zero emissions, right?
We don't really refer to zero emissions. We refer to net zero or absolute zero. Okay. And really no one's talking about absolute zero, or very few people are talking about absolute zero at the moment, because it is a real push just to get to net zero. And the reason why we're doing that is because the climate is heating up, and to slow that heating up down, we need to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere. And I am not, big disclaimer here, I am not a carbon scientist or a sustainability engineer or anything like that. I'm a business person and an energy business person. And so why we talk about it is because a lot of the work that we do actually delivers savings in emissions. And it's the quickest way to actually, we call it decarbonize your estate, your assets.
Actually, on that, something you and I have never talked about when we talk about this stuff, I may as well ask it here. Is carbon capture...
I can't wait.
I mean, we have such great conversations anyway about this stuff, but don't be scared, I promise.
You said carbon capture, so now I'm really scared. Yeah.
Well, I just don't I don't know if it's a viable actual option.
Yeah. And so I would suggest for this conversation, let's put it to the side because it is such a political topic. But what I will say about carbon capture, so effectively carbon capture is, just because we're defining terms in this, is using a process to capture carbon from high emitting processes like manufacturing gas and stuff like that. And you take that and you store it. You capture the carbon and you store it into, typically into the ground. You dig a borehole and you dig it into the ground. But there are natural forms of carbon capture as well. Correct.
I promise I'm not an idiot.
I did not suggest that you were. I
know, dude.
And I had to revisit my year three biology when I really did not understand why reforestation was a natural form of carbon capture. And so for anyone else out there who does not want to admit and step into their vulnerability, let me try and get this right, because effectively, as trees are saplings, they need to consume carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to grow. And that process of them ingesting that carbon dioxide is what helps it grow and turns into bark. And so as it grows and turns into bark, it's naturally absorbing carbon. So it's a natural carbon capture. So one of the strategies that a lot of governments are looking at, and the Queen, before she passed away, had it's called the Queen's Canopy, a program where they were doing that to have en masse massive carbon capture. It's a very, very topical subject at the moment.
So is this a big reason why a lot of politicals, like there's a big issue around the deforestation of like the Amazon and at this particular current time?
I think the thing to be aware with reforestation is when you've got a mature tree, it's actually not doing as much carbon capture as a really small tree because it's not doing so much growing, right? So if you've got a 1,000-year-old tree, and I'm not suggesting that you should, please, anyone listening to this, I am not suggesting that you should knock down all the really old trees and put new ones. That's not what I'm suggesting. All I'm saying is that part of the solution, whether it's through carbon capture through boring and digging holes in the ground, or it's carbon capture through trees, or it's every other solution that is going to be required to move towards this. And one of those solutions is actually reducing your energy consumption, which should actually be the first cab off the rank.
Okay. So the other term that I want us to try and define here, and I think this is going to be the most challenging of all of them, is sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
Because
thanks, okay.
Love you, Lena.
Love you too, Lee. So people, it's a great question because sustainability is actually a term that is used, defined by one of the world organizations, I can't remember whether it's the World Health Organization, or it'll come to me in a second, World Economic Forum. I think it's the World Economic Forum, where they had these sustainability goals. And within that, there are 27 of them, and they actually relate to a number of different parts of sustainability. Sustainability encompasses gender equality. It encompasses, combating poverty. It encompasses so many different areas, but one of the areas that it also encompasses really quite strongly is climate change. And so people have somehow come to relate emissions to sustainability, but it is so much more. So when people talk about sustainable solutions, typically people go to low emissions solutions for electricity. And people often, when they're talking about what I do, they say Lena's in sustainability. That's one aspect of an aspect of what we do, because the solutions deliver low emission outcomes. Did that make sense?
Yeah. Well, because look, sustainability is such a complicated term that's people used to greenwash a whole bunch of, their brand deliverables, et cetera, right? In our industry, there's so many layers to the term sustainability, because we're looking at the supply of or the sustainability of coffee as a complex agricultural product, but that as it's being grown, right? Because coffee is under a lot of pressure from climate change and from coffee leaf rust and a whole bunch of diseases that it's experiencing. So when we talk about sustainability in the coffee supply chain, that's one aspect of it. But another aspect of it is, how do we get it to the people who are going to roast it? And then once we get it to the people who are going to roast it, if energy security is an issue, and people are not focusing on the transition of energy, now we no longer have a sustainable supply chain, because we're battling issues that are preventing us from turning coffee from green to brown. And then when we look at further parts of that, we have business models that are under extraordinary amounts of stress. So from an economic perspective, our business models are not sustainable. So if we look at sustainability across the coffee value chain, it has so many different purviews. And so that's why I wanted to frame it for this discussion.
For this discussion, for the avoidance of doubt, it is about emissions. And there are other subjects that you can relate to it within they're called SDGs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So energy transition, that's the last of the terms.
Yep. The energy transition is what I referred to. I can't remember if it was in this episode or the last episode, but the move from fossil fuel based sources of electricity, like coal, to renewable energy. So the transition from that source to the other source, and the complexities of doing that, so the build and all of those, the build of the assets. It also refers to, so when you generate electricity, either in a solar farm or a coal-fired asset, it requires a electrical superhighway to get it to its end source in the home. And that is called the grid, right? It's an electricity grid that is made up by, the big ugly steel towers that you see around.
Power stations?
Power lines.
Okay, the power lines. Yep.
So there are really big ones that are transmission lines, and they are like the superhighway. And then to get it into your home, there's called a distribution network, which takes it and puts it in an appropriate capacity for you to consume it within your household. That grid, so that is what we call the grid. Wherever you are in the world, it's the same thing. Traditionally, it has been a single flow from the coal-fired or the generation source, let's call it a coal-fired power station, into the home. But now that same grid can take electricity from the home, because you can put rooftop solar on your home and you can export. So now it's a dual. The interesting thing about that is for the grid to work and it to be managed appropriately and deliver electricity wherever it needs to go. It has to be in constant balance of supply and demand every single second, right? And the grid needs a lot of work in Australia and in a lot of places around the world.
You mean from an infrastructure perspective?
Yeah, from an infrastructure and from a digital perspective as well, to be able to manage the dual flow of electricity.
Wow.
So if you got solar on your house, you want to leverage that to maximum capacity. Whatever you're not using, you want to be able to sell it back into the grid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now let's say the 20 plus million people in Australia who get rooftop solar on their house want to do the same thing. That's a whole lot of solar or electricity at a point where if the sun's shining everywhere in Australia, it's going to be tipping excess all in at the same time because no one's at home during the middle of the day. And then that's not when most people are using electricity. So the peak times for most people around the world, most people, not all cultures have the same patterns, but between the hours of, say, 6 to 8, people are getting ready for school, they're getting ready for work, they're having showers, they're making toast, they're using all of their, so they're using electricity and gas for that. They'll go to work, nothing. They won't use anything.
Right.
And then what they'll do is when they come home, they'll charge their phones, they'll make dinner, they'll have showers, they'll do work, they'll do washing, they'll run the dishwasher. All of those energy intensive processes will run again. So you get 2 peaks during the day. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So when the sun is shining, and the biggest peak is in the evening. So when the sun is shining, you actually don't have a lot of people at home using their electricity. Now, the thing for the coffee industry is a lot of those processes, I imagine, are happening during the day. So they can leverage that capacity through potentially solar or into the future, other technologies that could be what we call firm. So it doesn't matter if the sun's shining, the wind is blowing. They'll do it through hydrogen potentially or other processes that are used all the time. The other thing to remember as part of the energy transition is that there are technologies that are being invested in and developed that helps you shift this energy that you get during it's called renewable energy. So it's from a renewable energy source like the sun and the wind. If you can store it in a battery, then you can take that and use it in the evening.
Right.
And so you time shift.
Right. Except, and this is what I want to talk about in the next episode, except the problem is that the technology that we're using in the industry to do a bunch of stuff, whether it's be for producers who are predominantly mechanized in the way that they pick their coffee, or it's coffee roasters who are using that hybrid model that we spoke about in the last episode, or it's using gas stoves in cafes to cook a whole bunch of stuff that we're serving in hospitality venues. All of this infrastructure is very expensive to replace, and the technology is not yet there to make that happen. So, and we'll talk about that in the next episode. Okay? Fantastic. Peace, love, and peanut butter, everybody. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, friends. There are 2 ways you can support this podcast. Firstly, become a paid member of our YouTube channel. Secondly, you can join our Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video before you leave, and check the show notes for more information. Now, this is what you should check out next.